What is up, my friend? AJ Amyx here. I am a life coach who helps hungry leaders create their best life, navigate the challenges of marriage, heal from past pain, and experience more joy. And today I'm going to be diving into a topic that could potentially be triggering for some people, but this conversation, it needs to be had. I'm going to be discussing different types of childhood traumas and the potential impacts that it has on people's lives. So if some strong feelings come up for you as you watch this video, just remember to breathe. As crazy as it sounds, if you simply breathe with what arises for you, will actually help you rewire your nervous system. And what I mean by breathing is a deep breath into the belly, into the chest, with a simple exhale through the mouth. Simple. So please remember, your breath is your lifeline. Also, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the weekly videos that we're dropping here on this channel. And with that being said, let's get into the different types of childhood traumas. Well, trauma can occur in various forms, and no two people's experience is exactly the same. And trauma doesn't just have to be the big trauma stuff, you know? You see, I grew up in what I thought was a normal household. Like, nobody beat me, nobody molested me, nothing like that. And I used to think that I just didn't have any trauma. Now, I've come to understand that I was wrong. I've experienced a ton of emotional trauma. Now, I tell you this because whatever you've experienced or whatever decisions you've made up until this point, I believe those were the very best decisions that you could have made at that time, knowing what you knew then and having what skill sets that you had access to at that point in time. Now, I also believe that that was then and this is now, and that was them and this is you. And here in this moment, people have an opportunity to make new decisions and create new experiences. So with that being said, let's dive into some of the main categories of childhood trauma. First one up, physical abuse. Now, physical abuse is the first thing that often comes to mind when we talk about trauma. It involves any act of violence or rough treatment causing physical harm or injury. But remember, it's not just about visible bruises or scars. It can also involve more subtle harm like force feeding or neglect. You know, growing up, I used to go swimming with my dad at our local lake. I was probably 9 or 10 or something. And man, I could swim like a fish. Well, one day I remember I was with my dad and we're swimming at our family's lake house. And while I was swimming next to my dad, he just like grabbed my leg and like pulled me under. And I remember feeling like he was holding me underwater for like ever is what it felt like. And then he'd let me up and I'd breathe and I was thrashing around like trying to grasp for air. He'd say, "Don't panic," and then he'd pull me underwater again. And this would go on and on and on until I would just stop panicking while I was underwater, and then he would let me go and I could go back to like swimming or whatever. Well, I remember I was working with one of my coaches back in 2016. I'd flown out to Sedona, Arizona to be with him. And while we were hiking up Cathedral Rock, he asked me, he was like, "Yo man, do you have any trauma?" And I was like, "I'm good." And then this memory of the swimming story came to mind. So I jokingly shared and I was like, here's what happened about, the underwater thing. And he basically said, "Do you know that's physical abuse?" And I was like, "Nah, man, like my dad was just teaching me not to panic so I'd stay calm like in life." And my coach was like, "Maybe, but for where I'm sitting, seems like abuse to me." And it wasn't until that moment that I started to look back on my life and start seeing it for what it was. Now, let me be clear. My father wasn't maliciously abusive or anything like that. He was just a young 20-something-year-old kid raising a kid, doing the best he knew how to raise a boy that would do well in life. And after talking to my coach at that moment though, I saw in hindsight how that physical experience had a major impact on how I showed up in life. You see, prior to that conversation with my coach, anytime there was conflict in life, I'd freeze. I just shut down until the conflict was over, just like I did when my dad pulled me underwater. Now, I share this story vulnerably with you, not for sympathy or concern or even condemnation towards my father. I share this story to help you see how physical trauma can happen and how it can impact one's behavior and their life. Now, let's look at the next type of childhood trauma, emotional abuse. Now, emotional abuse may be harder to recognize because it really kind of leaves no physical marks. It involves behaviors that harm a child's self-worth or emotional well-being, including constant criticism, humiliation, and dismissal of their feelings. And man, I gotta tell you, I got this one in droves. See, I grew up in a home where both my mother and my father were completely emotionally unavailable, and the way I learned to cope with it was easy. Achieve things and be great. And even though I was the best academically and athletically, at least in my little world growing up, I still never ever heard those words, "I'm proud of you, son." And it was a blessing and it was a curse. It was a blessing because it drove me, and it was a curse because for many years, I was just never home and me just being me. Like for so many years, I was stuck in this never-ending loop trying to constantly prove and defend my worth, and all of that for me was just tied back to emotional trauma. And it was a bunch of big emotional trauma and a bunch of little things that stacked on top of one another for a really long time. Now, another kind of childhood trauma is sexual abuse. Sexual abuse involves forcing or persuading a child to participate in sexual activities. And it's crucial to note that this isn't always about physical contact and can involve exposure to inappropriate sexual content or behaviors. Now, I don't know if you know this, but 1 in 3 women have experienced sexual abuse, and 1 in 6 men have also experienced sexual abuse. Unfortunately, sexual abuse is so common, and honestly, I just feel bad that there's so much pain created around sex. Now, I share these stats not to downplay anything that you may have experienced. Instead, I share these stats to let you know if you have experienced sexual trauma of some sort, you're just not alone. I created another video all about toxic shame. I'll drop a link to it here in the description in case you'd like to watch it. And in that video, I talk about the only way to resolve toxic shame is to expose it. So if you've experienced sexual trauma and if you haven't talked to someone about it, please find a safe person who's willing to be a safe space for you so you can just share it and get that energy up and out of your body. And you may be surprised by how much of just the weight is lifted simply by talking about it with someone who's safe. Now, another kind of childhood trauma is neglect, and it's often overlooked. And it involves the failure to provide for a child's basic needs like food, clothing, hygiene, education, or emotional care. Now, this one for me was another one at the time I didn't know I was experiencing, and now looking back, I 100% experienced a lack of emotional care as well. Now, another form of childhood trauma is just traumatic events. Traumatic events are those things such as accidents, natural disasters, serious illnesses, or witnessing violence. These can create lasting impressions of fear and insecurity, not to mention toxic shame. Now, many people don't know this, but when a child is young, they filter every traumatic event as their fault, because it's the only way that their brain knows how to comprehend and process the trauma. See, it's easier for the child to control the pain and the shame of that traumatic event by it being their fault rather than their parents or their elders' fault. And this is why I'm saying traumatic events can create a lot of toxic shame for people if they don't process all of that stored up energy in their bodies. Now, these categories are not mutually exclusive and they often overlap, and many individuals, they experience more than one type of trauma. And unfortunately, trauma is part of the beingness of being human. It has been around for thousands of years, and the good news is by taking responsibility for how we choose to respond to the trauma, it makes a huge difference in our lives and the lives of others, getting better and better and better. And if we don't choose to take responsibility for how we respond to the trauma here and now, we will then pass on that stress to our partners and our children and live a life at a level that is just way less than what we're capable of and deserving of. Renowned trauma expert 𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏 wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and inside that book he talks about traumatic stress and how it literally rearranges our brain's wiring, specifically the areas of our brain dedicated to pleasure, engagement, control, and trust. If you haven't read that book, it's a great resource for learning more about the impact of childhood trauma and how to heal from it. You see, the impact of these traumas, they can manifest in a whole bunch of ways, including emotional, physical, or behavioral, or even health issues. And I explore these impacts in another video, so make sure you hit that subscribe button, you hit that bell notification thingy, and to make it easy, I'll even drop a link to that video in the description below. Now, I must say, this video is not meant to diagnose or replace professional help, and my hope is that this video sparks conversations and self-reflection and understanding in some kind of way for you. And if you think that you've experienced childhood trauma, please seek help from a mental health professional or a credible and experienced life coach. Remember, your past does not define you. Healing is possible, and it's never too late to start your journey, and you're not alone. So with that being said, tell me what you think. Like, what type of childhood trauma do you think has shaped your life in a huge way up to this point? Share it in the comments below, because you never know how sharing your story helps others know that they're not alone, and that you never know how sharing your story also helps others start their healing journey. If you found this video helpful, share it with friends, hit that subscribe button, and until next time, my friend, I'm out. Peace.